The ending of Square Enix's 2020 remake of the classic 1997 JRPG Final Fantasy VII left everyone with some big questions concerning the appearance of a dark-haired guy in a soldier uniform limping along the grasslands, dragging a very passed-out blonde protagonist with him. Fans of the original game reacted with a resounding, OMG, they did that? What does this mean? While new players were likely wondering, who the heck is this guy? And how/why is Cloud in two places at once? Allow us to clear up some confusion as we present a refresher or primer course on Best Boy Zack Fair. Zack made his initial appearance in the original Final Fantasy VII published by Squaresoft for the Sony PlayStation in 1997. He was first mentioned by Aerith in the park in the Sector 6 slums when she tells Cloud that her former boyfriend had, like Cloud, been in Soldier, an elite military branch of the Shinra Electric Power Company. Cloud asks his name, but before he can press Aerith for an answer, they're interrupted by the carriage carting Tifa to Don Corneo's mansion. And this is all the information we get about Zack until much later in the game, like deeply into Disc 2 later. That is, of course, unless the player has Aerith and Tifa in their party when they go to visit the village of Gongaga and speak to a couple in one of the houses who mention their missing son Zack. Aerith reveals that Zack was her first love, and Cloud is surprised that he's never heard of him, considering they were the same rank in Soldier. She mentions that he left on a mission 5 years ago and never returned. Tifa, on the other hand, is visibly shaken by the mention of the name Zack, well, as visibly shaken as polygons can be, and fumbles when denying that she knows him. She reflects on how Zack's story sounds just like Cloud's, boy from a small town, leaving for the big city, joining Soldier. After this, Zack fades into the deep background again until, as mentioned, a solid 20-plus hours later, we really learn about him, or at least the role he played in some pivotal past events. Since we're not assuming that everyone watching this video has played the original Final Fantasy VII, we'll keep it vague. But again, to get the most Zack information possible in the original release, the player had to make the choice to revisit a location on Disc 3 wherein we are introduced to the events that play out in greater detail in the Zack-centric prequel, Crisis Core. While this is not the next time we see Zack in Final Fantasy VII-related releases, that happens in the 2005 film Advent Children, set after the events of the original game, where he is basically a ghost, it is, chronologically speaking, the first time he ever appears. In Crisis Core and its remaster released for the PS4 and 5 in December 2022, Crisis Core Reunion, Zack, the only playable character, is an enthusiastic, optimistic young soldier lad from a tiny little town called, you already know it, Gongaga. And this kid is thriving. 7 years before Cloud helps Avalanche bomb a reactor, Zack is out here making a name for himself, fighting the Shinra Corporation's war with Wutai, hitting it off with all the ladies, and just generally being well-liked by everyone around him. He is the textbook definition of golden retriever energy. His mentor, Angeal Hewley, literally refers to him as Zack the Puppy. To summarize, there are three main soldier characters in addition to Zack: the aforementioned Angeal, Genesis, who grew up with Angeal, and Sephiroth, who needs no introduction. Both Angeal and Genesis are the result of a Shinra-sponsored genetic experiment involving Angeal's mother and Genova, an effectively mummified being Shinra found and decided was an ancient Orcetra, the original inhabitants of the planet. They learn this pretty early on in the story and abandon Shinra and Soldier. Genesis, with aspirations of finding the fabled gift of the goddess as described in the epic Loveless, which he views himself, Angeal, and Sephiroth as being the three key players in, and Angeal with sadness and anger at both the company and his own monstrous nature. Other key players in this game include Sung, the Turk who's keeping an eye on Aerith in Final Fantasy VII/7 Remake, Soldier Director Lazard, Dr. Hollander, the scientist behind the genetic experiments resulting in Angeal and Genesis, and Aerith herself, who, like Cloud after him, Zack meets after he falls through the roof of a church where she tends flowers. They quickly become a couple, naturally. And speaking of, Cloud also plays a supporting role here, a gloomy, spiky-haired infantryman who bonds with Zack over their mutual country bumpkin backgrounds. Additionally, Zack works alongside a young woman Turk, Cisne, who we already know is set to return in Rebirth. The youngest member of the team, Cisne takes a particular shine to Zack and is one of his key allies. Emotionally reserved due to basically being raised to be a Turk from childhood, Cisne is nonetheless close to her colleagues, playfully flirty with Zack, and the founder of his fan club. The first 2/3 of the game centers mostly around shenanigans with Genesis/Angeal and a bunch of their copies, and ends up with Zack tracking them and Hollander to a mountain town called Nibelheim, where he ends up having to kill his former mentor, who leaves him with his Buster Sword, and a hope that Zack will continue to live with honor and become a hero. Even after the real Angeal's death, Angeal and Genesis copies are still running wild, including one of the former who shows up to the Sector 5 church to watch over Aerith. Director Lazard defects from Shinra and releases the incarcerated Hollander to do more genetic experiments, mostly because, we learn later, Lazard himself is an Angeal copy and his cells are beginning to degenerate. Genesis is also suffering from degeneration, along with all his copies. During this time frame, 4 to 5 years before the original FF7, Zack is also featured in a chapter of the Turk-focused mobile game Before Crisis, wherein he once again has to kill some former friends. All this is to say, Zack has been through a lot of emotional torment, and Shinra's health insurance almost certainly doesn't cover the therapy he most definitely needs. Nonetheless, he remains a good boy, doing his best to fulfill Angeal's final wish. And here, good viewers, is where we might cross the line into spoiler territory, but if you've only played Final Fantasy VII Remake and managed to not learn anything about the OG game in the last 27 years, you won't entirely realize what's being spoiled for you, and even then you may be more confused than outright spoiled, especially if you just played the Rebirth demo. Anyway, proceed with caution. The small mountain haven of Nibelheim, which just so happens to be where Cloud grew up, has been increasingly plagued with monsters gathering around its long-standing Mako reactor. Shinra finally responds to their plea for help, sending Sephiroth along with a small team consisting of Zack, Cloud, and another basic infantry guy to investigate. Cloud has yet to achieve his dream of even joining Soldier, let alone making first class, so he keeps it on the DL that he's back in town. He certainly doesn't reveal his identity to the local mountain guide assigned to lead them to the reactor, who turns out to be none other than best girl, Tifa Lockhart. After a harrowing trip, they make it to the reactor and find a bunch of mutated humanoids incubating in pods. And wouldn't you know it, their old pal Genesis shows up to inform the Pride of Soldier, Sephiroth, that he too is part of a genetic experiment, Project S, part of the Genova Project, Shinra's attempt to create a human ancient hybrid. Unborn baby Sephiroth was directly injected with Genova cells while developing, and considered to be a greater success than the two Project G babies, Angeal and Genesis. So Sephiroth spends a week in the library in the basement of the old Shinra mansion, which conveniently contains years and years of well-documented research on his origin, and absolutely loses his shit. He decides that he is a superior being, meant to inherit and rule supreme over the planet/cosmos at large, and burns down the entire town of Nibelheim before taking off to the reactor to exhume his mother from her giant test tube. Zack races after him and finds Tifa on the floor of the reactor, barely clinging to life. He pursues Sephiroth into the inner chamber and confronts him just as successfully as Tifa did, which is to say, not at all. He gets his ass beat and yeeted into the outer part of the reactor. Then, Cloud arrives. After a clash, Sephiroth winds up in the life stream below the reactor, Cloud ends up face down on the stairs next to Zack, and the two lose consciousness as a group of Shinra researchers, including the nefarious Professor Hojo, who you'll certainly recall from 7 Remake, arrive. When Zack awakens, he discovers, oh no, now he too is in a giant test tube. But he's got that soldier power, prolonged exposure to pure Mako, to make him strong. So he busts out of there, kills the orderly looking after him, and frees Cloud. Unfortunately, Cloud is basically non-responsive, and Zack theorizes he has contracted Mako poisoning since his body was not previously conditioned to the substance. Determined to reunite with his beloved Aerith, Zack trudges toward Midgar with Cloud in tow. En route, he reunites with Cisne near his hometown of Gungaga, who warns him against returning there but promises to keep an eye on his parents. And from what we know about her appearance in Rebirth, it seems she permanently set up residence there. Everything gets resolved with Genesis, Hollander, and Lazard, though Genesis doesn't actually die, but he also hasn't figured out how to stop his degeneration problem. Hollander and Lazard both kick it, though, so we definitely won't be seeing them again. The final Angeal copy, the one who's been looking after Aerith, delivers her final letter to Zack, and he realizes that he hasn't been gone for a few weeks. He was locked up in that basement in Nibelheim for 4 years. With renewed determination, Zack and the still catatonic Cloud hitch a ride on a truck and are back on the road to Midgar. Unfortunately, Shinra is out there looking for them. Sung attempts to find our boys before the army does, but tragically fails. With Cloud safely hidden or deemed to be not a threat / worth killing interchangeably, Zack makes a valiant final stand, but is ultimately overwhelmed and mortally wounded. Now, in the original flashback scene in Final Fantasy VII, Zack collapses dead, Cloud comes to and crawls over to discover Zack's dead body. In Crisis Core, though, they just had to tug at those heartstrings a little harder. Here, as Zack lays dying, he is happy to discover that Cloud recovered and leaves him the Buster Sword, telling Cloud that he will be his living legacy. In the OG game, Cloud just took the sword while mourning his friend's passing, but, he was really, really mourning it. Those are some emotional polygons. And that's the end of Zack. Or is it? Obviously not, or we wouldn't be making this video. The ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake included Zack's last stand with a very, very big change. Zack didn't die. After the defeat of the Whispers, Zack was knocked back by a burst of light from Midgar and, upon recovering, continues his trek back to the city with Cloud still unconscious and being dragged along beside him. We get a dramatic shot of him and Aerith walking past one another unseen, possibly in different, now divergent timelines. So, what the heck? We know for sure that Zack is going to play a role in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth 1 because the people making these games are smart and wouldn't just casually resurrect him for no reason, and 2, because we've seen him in all the previews and advertising. Specifically, we've seen him hanging around Marlene with Aerith lying seemingly in a coma and Cloud still unresponsive in a wheelchair. So what does it all mean? At this point, it's theory, but the multiple timeline idea has legs. After all, we know that the Whispers in Final Fantasy VII Remake were doing their darndest to ensure that all events proceeded exactly as they had in the original Final Fantasy VII, and Zack managed to survive only after the Whispers had been defeated, albeit several weeks before their defeat in the timeline Remake is currently following. But since Aerith's greatest wish, as established in letters she sent in Crisis Core, was to spend more time with Zack, it checks out that, given the opportunity to change history, she'd want to save his life, right? Many unanswered questions remain, and it's up to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth to resolve them. But until it does, we can simply rejoice in the fact that our boy is back. And for those of you just meeting him, hopefully you're beginning to understand the widespread and well-deserved love of Zack Fair.